I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and welcome to Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. Today we explore The God of Wild Places, a new book by author, theologian, outdoorsman, and philosopher Tony Jones, about the journey of rediscovering the divine in the wild places we encounter in life. We often talk about relationship between man and nature, the exploration of wild places, yet there's a wildness within us that may have a lot to learn from the wildness in nature. Let's meet our guest, Tony Jones. Tony, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Peter. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. Well, I'm sitting on a beautiful early July day in Minnesota. I live just outside of the Twin Cities with my dear wife Courtney, who is a yoga instructor and photographer, and our two dogs. She's got a little rescue pup, and I've got a hunting dog named Crosby, who's the cover model on the book in my canoe in the Boundary Waters. He's a Boundary Waters veteran as a dog, and yeah, I'm just excited to be here to talk about my book and about the different maybe parallels that we have in our journeys and stuff like that.
Well, and yeah, you began as a man of the cloth, as a minister, and at some point you challenged that for yourself, not the validity in general. And you'll talk about that a little bit, that journey of how you sort of embraced the ministry and then all of a sudden learned that there might be another way. Because for a lot of people, the ministry is not working today, and your point of view might have some relevance.
Yeah, it's funny because I mean, if you look at it in purely secular terms, you'd have to say that the church in America is an industry in decline. You know, it's like I don't know, it's like the phone booth industry or the payphone industry. You know, there's just certain things that it seems it's really surprising actually to a lot of people, and it's one of the big stories in the church, in the religious landscape, is the way people are leaving organized religion in America. It's really unprecedented, and I'm among them. You know, like you alluded to, and I write about this in the book, I felt a calling to ministry from a very early age, from like 7th grade, when I first said I want to be a minister when I grow up. And I just followed that trajectory, man. I mean, through high school and college, I went straight to seminary, and then I went straight into ministry in my 20s. And I thought that was my life's goal. You know, I thought that by age 56, I'd be a senior pastor of a big church, you know, but it didn't turn out that way. My life took some left turns, you know, and I had to kind of reconfigure myself, and ended up finding my spiritual home in the outdoors rather than inside church walls.
You know, for many of the people that we engage on our show and in the Midwest, a lot of it's about dealing with life's traumas.
Yeah.
And we have the existential ones and the ones that, well, you know, how do I relate to God? Why am I here? Where am I going? And then we have the very real ones when you have a family, and as you address those questions and the core values and the happinesses in your families, you go through trauma.
Yeah.
You know, the families fall apart a little bit, and then you have to reorient. And these are troubling, tough times. I mean, so many people suffer through breakups without a lot of support, and in a vacuum of sort of a faithless life.
Mm-hmm.
But yet you found that there was sort of a vacuum in your life when that happened too, that your obsession with faith drove you to a place where you weren't the human being you felt you could be.
Yeah, Peter. I mean, one of the weird juxtapositions in my life, you know, in my late 30s and into my early 40s, was that I was having extraordinary success professionally as a pastor and as a Christian author and public speaker, and I was flying around the world, and I was flying high, metaphorically speaking. You know, I was people looked at my life and were like, wow, that guy's clicking on all cylinders. But of course, what they didn't know is that there was a whole bunch of grief and turmoil in my personal life, in my family life. I was in a marriage that was toxic for everybody involved, for me and my spouse and my 3 kids. It was a toxic environment, and we could not figure out how to fix it for whatever reasons, you know? And so having to walk out of that family and basically start over at age 40 with my life. I mean, out of my house, you know, didn't have a car, like lost all my speaking gigs, lost publishing contracts. That it all went away. And that's a terrifying experience. But you know, every spiritual tradition teaches in the world that you grow and learn in those what's called the dark night of the soul, or rock bottom in the AA world, or whatever. Like that's when that's the refiner's fire in which you really are forged.
Well, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, I'd like to address that idea of the turning point when you started to find your salvation in the outdoors. Stay tuned. We'll see you all after the break. You don't want to miss this.
Well, because it's the best. And that's true, because I've thought about that. I mean, definitely the fastest. And the biggest thing I hear most people talk about is the stability of it.
MediaCom's network is very reliable. We have a lot of programs in place that can monitor kind of issues that arise. That way we can fix them before they reach the customer.
Trust the pros. Get extreme internet starting at $9.99 a month for a year.
Malware and bots and worms, oh my. The wild, wild web can be a scary and complex place. And as our digital world expands, so too are the threats. Watch out, Trojan horse. That's why at MediaCom, we take security very seriously and monitor our networks around the clock to stop threats before they can affect you. Not today, rude kid. Not all internet is created equal. We build ours to keep you connected and protected.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and we're speaking with Tony Jones about, well, God, and how as a Christian culture, we may have lost our way in the wilderness of the divine, and that there may be lessons in the wilderness that can lead us back to the divine. Tony, tell us a little bit about how you found your salvation in the woods.
Peter, I recount a story early in the book that happened when I was a youth pastor, and I had a big church, and I was an angry young man. I had a lot of anger that was, you know, of course, well, we could go into where it came from, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is I didn't have healthy ways to express it. I didn't know how to manage it. And it came out one night at a youth committee meeting. And probably you've got some viewers who've, you know, been on a youth committee at a church, helped plan the confirmation banquet and the summer mission trip and whatever. And so these were just these very sweet, you know, parents of kids in the youth group who were there to help out. And I lost it. I blew up at them one night at a meeting, and the chair ended the meeting and walked me to my car. And I ended up having coffee with him a couple days later, and he started telling me his story. And he was a recovering alcoholic, and had rage issues of his own. He encouraged me to get into an anger management class, which I did. And he asked to take me duck hunting in Lake of the Woods in Ontario, Canada. And I ended up going with him. And it really was one of those experiences of my life that, like I write about in the book, that just profoundly and deeply touched me with a sense of peace that I was lacking in my normal everyday life as a working pastor and a young, you know, husband and father. But then I didn't go hunting again for 10 more years. And it wasn't until that marriage was ending, and then I was struggling, you know, and not knowing what to do. And I remembered that, how much I enjoyed that, how much it meant to me. And all I can say, Peter, is that I started feeling pulled or called to the outdoors in the same way I had felt called into church ministry decades before. I was feeling called to spend more time in the outdoors.
That's fascinating because in one thing I related to in the book was my first grouse hunt as a young kid with my uncle. And boy, it's hard to describe what kind of a bullet trajectory grouse have when they take off. And we were hunting without dogs on our own land in Wisconsin. And an interesting thing happened is that as we were approaching the grouse, I spotted them under the tree before we flushed them. And then of course, what is the obvious question the kid asked? Well, why are we making them hard to hit? Why don't we just shoot them here? And my uncle was fairly philosophical. He said, well, you'll figure it out. And so we went through this process, and I missed, I don't know how many shots in the course of the day. I mean, it wasn't double figures, but it was enough that was frustrating for a kid that thought he was a pretty good shot. And but then the killing part of it came because he had hit some. And all of a sudden I had really mixed emotions. But it had a dramatic effect on my life, not negative, just an understanding that there's this great circle of life. And I saw that so much in your book, where you learn so much respect for the natural order of things. What about that was the most important learning?
Well, Peter, there's a couple things. I mean, your story reminds me, there's a couple aspects of the book. One, there's an entire chapter called Failure. And I recount a story in there about my son shooting, firing 6 shells at 6 pheasants, which are a lot easier to hit than grouse, and missing all 6, and being a young, he was maybe 13 at the time, and the anger and frustration and embarrassment, and the lesson he learned from another guy in our hunting party, that failure is a part of hunting. And I'll be honest, I grew up in a pretty privileged, luxurious world, as a straight white guy in Edina, Minnesota, and headed off to an Ivy League college. And things were like, I had not experienced much failure in my life. I had pretty much gotten where the college I wanted to get into, the graduate school I wanted to get into, the job I wanted to get, the wife, the kid, the dog, the house, until it all fell apart. And then I had this one big failure. And I do think part of the outdoors life that is so attractive to me is that failure is woven into it, whether it's hunting or fishing, but it even can just be, as you know, as a canoeist in the Boundary Waters, trying to find a portage as it's getting dark and the mosquitoes are coming out. Failure is baked in the cake, man. I mean, you can't avoid failure. And so I love that aspect of the outdoors life, is that failure, everyone who's involved in it knows failure is part of the deal. You cannot escape it. So you got to figure out ways to accept it, understand it, be okay with yourself, have some kind of grace with yourself when you fail. And that's been a huge lesson for me in the outdoors.
Yeah, we're surrounded by the lessons. We don't see them. It's almost like baseball. You go to the Hall of Fame batting 300 or 350, which means you miss the ball more often than you hit it. And you're a superstar. Right. Yet in life, we don't let that happen. Well, we're going to take another short break. This is really fascinating. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Stay tuned to us. You really don't want to miss this. It's a lot of fun. See you after the break.
Glitching.
I told you with our new Extreme Internet, it will be smooth streaming.
That's unbelievable.
Well, you better believe it, Missy.
I already finished streaming the whole 2nd season of my show.
So start the 3rd.
What the fast? That's really not frustrating.
I'll take that as a compliment.
You should.
I'm gonna get some ice cream. Do you want some?
With the drama-free reliability of Extreme Internet, you'll have to create your own. Get super fast internet with whole home Wi-Fi for as low as $24.99 a month for a year.
You told me not to talk to strangers. You told me not to cross the street without looking both ways.
You told me not to touch the stove. You told me not to do drugs. You told me not to drink and drive.
You gave me so many messages about how to stay safe. Why didn't you keep me safe by properly storing your gun?
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. We're talking to author Tony Jones. And from my point of view, I see that we carve out our values, ideas, and hopes and happiness out of our experiences. But in this modern era, we often narrow our worldview to the idea of self as the center of a universe, evolving from our choices, egos, and desires. It's easy to get lost when failure is not an option. And nature provides evidence that success is a result of navigating failures, and that's one excellent theme in Tony's book, The God of Wild Places. But Tony, I want to start this off by asking you a question, because I heard you say on one of your other speaking engagements that this is the shortest book you've ever written, which makes it extremely readable, and I love the prose, but it also took you the longest to write.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, Peter, because it's my story, it's my memoir, and it deals with a lot of touchy subjects. Like, I mean, there were just in the writing of a memoir, I did so much reading of memoirists whom I respect. And how much of your story can you tell? And you've got somebody like Mary Karr who says, I don't care if I lose friends or family members. My job is to be a truth teller. And you've got someone like Anne Lamott who says, I would never write anything negative about somebody I love because my relationships are far more important to me than my literary career. So that's a wide spectrum of what you can write about. But, when writing about the issues I'm writing about in the book, do you write about your ex-spouse? Do you write about your kids when they were young? These were tricky topics to write, and I wrote and rewrote and revised to try to get it right so that it was both honest and it was sensitive to the people who were implicated by my story. That was a part of it, and frankly, it just took me a long time to get as honest and vulnerable as I ended up being in the book. It took me a long time to be okay with that. So I had to write my way into that.
And also maybe there was a little something to do with waiting for the children to get old enough to embrace the idea as well.
There's that too. I mean, this memoirist I just mentioned, Mary Karr, she says you should not write about anything until it's at least 8 years in the past. And, I agree with her now. I didn't when I started, but now you're right. Yes, my kids had to grow, and I asked them if they wanted to read it, and I think all they did was search for their names in the manuscript and just read the few sentences about each of them and said, "Nah, we're okay with it." So that was it.
Now, a person does become a book, but a person is also much more than what's in the book.
Yeah.
And I know you're out in the wilderness, you're out with groups, you're out talking to people. What are some of the themes that you find are sort of becoming essential to what your life is about in this book with the people you meet?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm taking a group to the Boundary Waters this September, and they're all guys who are in recovery. And I'm not a alcoholic. I'm not an addictive kind of person, but they are, and they want to go out and paddle around in the Boundary Waters, and every night around the campfire have a meeting, have a 12-step meeting, and that's interesting to me because that's not something I went out and sought. That's not something I'm marketing. Oh, I do recovery trips in the Boundary Waters. They sought me and said, would you take us out on a trip like that? So I guess what's gratifying to me is how maybe the message of the book, and just in general my life, you might even call it my ministry these days, which is very different than my old ministry, is reaching out and touching people I would not have expected.
Having worked and working with a lot of people in recovery, I immediately saw the relevance of your book to people in recovery, because your life becomes 52 card pickup, and you have to reframe it with a whole new experience. You can't have the old friends, the old ways, the old stuff. And there's a connection with the divine that's important. And from my point of view, as unforgiving as the wilderness is, I found it as a human for it to be the most forgiving environment I've ever been in.
Oh, interesting.
I find it saying, because I also understand that if that tree falls on me and that's the end of my life in the wilderness, it's okay, because that's where I'd be. Now, I'm not looking for that experience.
Yeah, but
there's a sense of completeness. It's different than getting up in the morning and your mother says, put on clean underwear in case you have to go to the doctor or something. I mean, it's different than that type A, what's in my quiver today of tasks to do. And then when I get to the end of the day, no matter how fast I've run, there's always more to do the next day than the day before. And so that's probably an area that your prose didn't indicate that the wilderness had that compassionate capability, but I felt it coming out of your words. So in a way, I think you sort of promoted it as well. But maybe you didn't realize.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social worker, so I may be talking a bit out of school here for a moment, but allow me enough leash to do myself in here. But I'm sure there were people in the past, our ancestors, who struggled with addictions, who struggled with chemical use, whatever those chemicals may be. But in general, I think if you're living a wilderness life, the wilderness is so demanding. I mean, we just live such a life of luxury now, such a life of safety, and we go from one air-conditioned space into another air-conditioned space. We're just comfortable all the time. But that also has bred a certain malaise in a lot of people, particularly as a youth pastor, I can tell you, in a lot of teenagers. And, adolescence used to be the time when you forged yourself, and our ancestors did it in the wild places. You would kill your first animal on your first hunt, or you would make your first jacket out of a pelt. And kids today, in so many ways, are somewhat lost. And I think the wilderness can re-engage them in some of those old practices.
Wow, that is very powerful. We're going to take a short break. We're going to ask Tony to come back afterwards and share some final comments, insights, and inspiration. Let's revel in this wonderful message. See you all after the break. You don't want to miss this.
I don't remember how it started.
Go to bed.
Our back and forth. It always came back.
Dad!
You probably don't remember what you told me,
That was perfect.
but I heard every word.
Watching MC22 is now easier than ever before. All MediaCom customers can watch local programming online anytime. Go to mc22.net, click Watch MC22, and log in with your MediaCom account. Not a MediaCom cable subscriber? MediaCom internet or phone subscribers can watch too. Your local programming leader, MC22, online at mc22.net/watch.
Dad! Dad, I'm not glitching!
I told you with our new extreme internet, it will be smooth streaming.
That's unbelievable!
Well, you better believe it, Missy.
I already finished streaming the whole second season of my show.
So start the third.
What the fast? That's really not frustrating.
I'll take that as a compliment.
You should.
I'm gonna get some ice cream. Do you want some?
With the drama-free reliability of Extreme Internet, you'll have to create your own. Get super fast internet with whole home Wi-Fi for as low as $24.99 a month for a year.
Welcome back. Today on Surviving Bad, we explored The God of Wild Places, a new book by author Tony Jones. It was about the journey of rediscovering the divine in wild places. Let's see what final insights and inspiration Mr. Tony Jones has to share with us today. Tony, you're back on.
Well, Peter, thanks again for having me. It's been a great conversation. I wish even the people who watch the show could have heard the conversations you and I had, off mic or whatever. But no, I appreciate it. I'm really gratified by the reception of the book. And, I guess I'd say this one thing that I learned a lot. I mean, basically, I went into the book thinking, I feel like the wilderness has saved my life after a very difficult time. What is it? What is it about the wilderness that saved my life? And so we've already touched on some of the things, like finding peace or failure. There's a chapter on failure. There's a chapter on my dogs, my hunting dogs with whom I have this incredible bond. And toward the end, there's a chapter about death. And that is one thing as I've grown older, and that by becoming more, I guess, cognizant or conscious of my mortality, the fact that my life is going to end. I have a limited time on this planet. And what can I do with the limited time I have? That goes back to ancient Stoic philosophy. And those ancient philosophers had this phrase, memento mori, remember your mortality, remember your death. And I think a lot of times as modern people, we think of that's very morbid. Oh, you think about your death all the time. They didn't think of it as morbid. They thought of it as, if you have your mortality in front of you at all times, you're going to live a better life. You're going to live fuller days. You're going to love people better. You're going to care for yourself better. So that, I think that's just another aspect of the wilderness that's been really has affected me internally.
Having been with more than one close relative, parents and uncles, on the moments they passed and in the moments just before, in the days and months before, they all think about that death.
Yeah.
And their advice to me is often start thinking about it earlier rather than later, because it tells you how to live.
Right.
And that's such an important point that comes across in your book too, that I was inspired by the fact that you took all these terrible situations and there was always a path of sort of glory out of it. Not without angst, not without, some baggage that you have to carry, because that's what life is about, but because you went through that wilderness and found a way. And then you told a story in a way that I felt like I was walking right next to you.
Well,
that you were sharing it with me around a campfire. And that's rare in any book in my world.
That's high praise, Peter. That's high praise. And yeah, I tried to do that in the writing. And, when you're out in the wilderness, as death, you just see examples of death all around. We've really inoculated ourselves from death in the modern world. And we sweep away our dead people. They die in hospitals, and then they run to the mortuary. And out in the wilderness, man, it's right in your face.
Well, I know we have a bunch of links to how to get to your book. I can certainly tell you that I recommend it highly, and I have had recommended to my friends. I found it a great read. And if you don't want to spend a lot of money, buy it once. It's not that expensive, and share it with your friends, and they'll thank you for it. So I thank you for joining us today, Tony. And for all of you watching today, check out our website at healthyiowa.org and keep your eye on MediaCom MC22 for our next episode of Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. I'm MediaCom MC22, your local programming leader.